This podcast is sponsored by the book, The Concept, A Critical and Honest Look at God and Religion, by Bo Bennett, Ph.D. Challenge your beliefs and explore faith through science and reason. Discover more at godtheconcept.com.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Excited to jump into another one of these deep dives with you.
Yeah.
Today we're looking at the book of Matthew, but through a slightly different lens, right?
Yeah.
So we're not coming at this from a place of faith or belief.
Right.
But we are going to be kind of digging into it from a secular and skeptical perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is a really valuable way to look at these texts because
I agree.
It allows us to kind of like step back from any kind of preconceived notions that we might have.
Right.
And look at these stories and teachings and try to understand them in the context of the time period in which they were written.
Absolutely. And the way that we're going to do that today is we found some really interesting excerpts from this online piece that we're not going to name.
Right.
But it really digs deep into some contradictions and inconsistencies within the text.
Yeah.
And also compares it to historical and scientific perspective.
Exactly. And that's where I think, some of the most intriguing questions arise because,
Right.
When we start to look at these ancient texts through the lens of our modern understanding of the world,
Exactly.
it can raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we hope to do today is raise some eyebrows
Yeah.
and get people thinking about this in a new way.
Yeah.
So I guess to kind of kick things off,
Sure.
let's start with something that is very central to the book of Matthew, and that is the genealogy of Jesus.
Right.
So Matthew really kind of painstakingly goes through tracing Jesus's lineage back to King David,
Yeah.
which is a very, vital lineage for fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the genealogy is presented in a very, like you said, kind of painstaking
Right.
and deliberate way to really make that connection clear
Right.
between Jesus and this long line of Jewish kings.
Absolutely. But then we hit a bit of a snag.
Yeah.
And the snag is that when you compare Matthew's genealogy with the genealogy presented in the Gospel of Luke,
Right.
they're different.
They're strikingly different.
Right. So how do we grapple with that? How do we reconcile these two different genealogies?
Yeah. And this is a question that has puzzled biblical scholars for centuries.
Yeah.
And there are a number of different theories that have been proposed.
Good.
One theory is that Matthew and Luke were drawing on different sources.
Okay.
So they may have had access to different traditions or different genealogical records.
Makes sense.
Another theory is that they were actually trying to make different theological points.
Okay.
So, for example, Matthew may have been emphasizing the Davidic lineage
Right.
to establish Jesus's legitimacy as the Messiah
To a shoddy.
for a Jewish audience, exactly.
Right.
Whereas Luke may have been tracing Jesus's lineage back to Adam
Okay.
to emphasize his universal significance
To a Gentile audience.
to Gentile audience,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right. That's fascinating because it really kind of like
Yeah.
you start to think about, well, who are these Gospels written for? What was the intention behind them?
Right.
And it adds this whole other layer to kind of trying to understand the text.
It does. And it also raises questions about the historicity of these genealogies.
Right.
Like, are these meant to be taken as literal genealogical records? Or are they more like theological constructs?
Right. Or they meant to kind of tell a story.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to another story
Sure.
that always kind of captured my imagination, and that is the birth narrative with the String of Bethlehem.
Right.
So, you have these wise men, these magi, who are following this star
Yeah.
to the birthplace of Jesus.
Yeah. A magical image. Right.
Yeah, it's very magical. But,
Yeah.
when you start to look at it from an astronomical perspective,
Right.
stars don't actually function as GPS devices.
No, they don't.
They don't guide people to specific locations.
Right.
So how do we reconcile this with the story?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those places where I think the tension between a literal interpretation of the Bible and a more symbolic or metaphorical interpretation really comes to the forefront.
Right.
Because, if we're taking this story literally, then we have to come up with some explanation for how a star could have actually led the Magi to Bethlehem.
Right.
But if we're open to the possibility that the story is meant to be understood symbolically, then it opens up a whole range of other interpretations.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure. So, some astronomers have proposed that the Star of Bethlehem could have been a conjunction of planets.
Okay.
like Jupiter and Saturn,
Okay.
which would have been a rare and significant occurrence in ancient times.
Right.
Others have suggested that it could have been a comet or a supernova,
Right.
some kind of celestial event that would have been seen as a sign
Right.
of something special happening.
Right. Right. Right.
And then, of course, there's the possibility that the star is simply a literary device, a way of highlighting the importance of Jesus's birth and connecting it to Old Testament prophecies.
Okay. So it's more about the meaning behind the story than the literal event.
Right, exactly. And I think that's true for a lot of the stories in the Bible.
Yeah.
I think there's a deeper meaning there.
Okay. That's
And
deep.
just the surface level of the text.
All right. Well, let's move on to another section of Matthew.
Sure.
And this one I think is very well known, and that is the Sermon on the Mount,
Yeah.
which is full of all these really profound teachings.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount is one of the most famous and influential passages in the entire Bible.
Absolutely.
It's full of these ethical teachings that have really resonated with people
Yeah.
for centuries.
For sure. I mean, like, blessed are the peacemakers.
Right.
Like, you can't really argue with that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a beautiful teaching.
Like timeless message.
Yeah, but then nestled within these beautiful teachings are some verses that are a little bit more difficult.
Difficult, challenging, yeah.
Right, to kind of reconcile with modern day society.
Right.
And one example that comes to mind is the verse about cutting off your hand
Right.
if it causes you to sin.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a pretty extreme example.
Right. And most people would agree that,
Yeah.
self-mutilation is probably not the answer.
No.
So how do we understand that?
Yeah, so I think when we're dealing with these more challenging passages, it's important to remember that the Bible was written in a very different historical and cultural context
Right.
than our own.
Right. Right.
So what might have been considered acceptable or even understood metaphorically back then
Right.
might seem completely out of place to us today.
Absolutely.
So, in the case of the verse about cutting off your hand, I think it's important to understand that it's not meant to be taken literally.
Okay.
It's a hyperbole.
Okay.
It's a way of emphasizing the seriousness of sin and the need to take drastic measures to avoid it.
Okay, so it's more about kind of removing those temptations
Right.
from your life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's about rooting out the source of the problem
Interesting.
rather than literally cutting off your hand.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about miracles
Sure.
because Matthew is full of them.
Yeah. The Gospels are full of miracles.
And these are central to Christian faith, but
Yeah.
some of them, clash a little bit with our understanding of science.
Right.
So, you have the story of Jesus walking on water.
Yeah.
You have the feeding of the 5,000,
Right.
where Jesus multiplies a few loaves and fishes
Mhm.
to feed a huge crowd.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we approach these stories from a secular perspective?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think there are a couple of different ways that we can approach these stories.
Okay.
One way is to simply acknowledge that they're miracles, and that miracles, by definition, are supernatural events that defy our understanding of the natural world.
Okay.
So, if we're coming at this from a secular perspective, we might say, well, we don't believe in the supernatural, so we
Right.
don't believe that these events actually happened.
Okay.
But another way to approach these stories is to look for the deeper meaning,
Okay.
to try to understand what they might be trying to teach us about Jesus or about God or about the human condition.
Okay. So kind of similar to what we were talking about with the Star of Bethlehem.
Exactly.
So for example, the story of Jesus walking on water
Yeah.
could be seen as a metaphor for his power over nature.
Right. Or his ability to overcome obstacles
Right.
that seem insurmountable.
Okay.
And the feeding of the 5,000 could be seen as a symbol of his ability to provide for our needs.
Right.
Even when resources are scarce.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, right.
And I think that kind of leads us into the final and probably most important event
Right.
in the book of Matthew, which is the resurrection of Jesus.
Yes, absolutely. The cornerstone of Christian belief.
Yeah. And Matthew describes this very dramatic scene with an earthquake and the stone being rolled away from the tomb
Yeah.
and Jesus appearing to his followers.
Right.
But, from a purely historical perspective,
Yeah.
there are some questions that we need to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the resurrection is one of the most hotly debated events in history.
Yeah.
And there's no shortage of theories and interpretations about what actually happened.
Right.
But I think from a skeptical perspective, one of the first questions we have to ask is there any independent corroboration for this event?
Okay.
Do we have any accounts of the resurrection from non-Christian sources?
From people who weren't.
From people who weren't.
Already followers of Jesus.
Exactly. Yeah. And the answer to that question is unfortunately no.
Okay.
We don't have any contemporary historical records that mention the resurrection.
Right. Right.
Which, isn't necessarily proof that it didn't happen.
Right.
But it does raise some questions.
Right.
About the historicity of the event.
Okay. And then you also have the issue of the different accounts of the resurrection across the four Gospels.
Exactly, yeah. The four Gospels tell slightly different versions of the story.
Right, so they don't necessarily all agree on every detail.
Right, and that can make it difficult to know what to make of the event.
Right, right.
Are these differences just minor discrepancies? Or do they point to something more fundamental?
Okay, so I guess the question is, are these meant to be literal accounts of what happened?
Right.
Or are they meant to convey a theological message?
Right, exactly. And I think that's a question that each individual has to answer for themselves.
Right.
There's no easy answer.
Yeah, well, I think it's been really fascinating to go through this with you and kind of look at these stories that I've grown up with, but through a completely different lens.
Yeah.
And I think it's really opened up my mind to new ways of interpreting these texts.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of approaching these ancient texts from a secular and skeptical perspective.
Yeah.
Is that it allows us to ask these questions that we might not otherwise ask.
Right.
And it allows us to see these stories in a new light.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the question that I would leave our listeners with is, does analyzing these biblical accounts through a different lens change how you understand them?
Yeah.
Does it make you question certain things? Does it make you think about them in a new way?
Yeah, and maybe even more importantly, does it make you want to learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the goal here, is to keep asking questions.
Exactly, yeah.
And to keep learning.
Yeah.
And to not be afraid to challenge our own beliefs.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, hopefully this has been a thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah.
And we encourage you to continue exploring these questions on your own.
Yeah, there's so much more to discover.
Absolutely. All right, thanks for listening.
Thanks.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.